When Michael Jordan stepped into the Great Pyramid of Giza, he thought it was just another photo opportunity during a simple promotional tour in Egypt. But what he found hidden deep inside those ancient stone walls would shake the entire world and change everything we thought we knew about human history. The Egyptian government had secretly discovered something buried beneath the pyramid, something so incredible and so dangerous that they needed the most trusted man on the planet to witness it first. What Michael touched in that hidden chamber gave him powers he never imagined and revealed a truth that had been buried for thousands of years. This is the shocking true story of what really happened that day. The desert wind carried whispers of ancient secrets as Michael Jordan stepped out of the black SUV, his sneakers touching Egyptian sand for the first time in his life. The Great Pyramid of Giza loomed before him, casting a shadow that seemed to reach across millennia, and something in his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had come to Egypt on what was supposed to be a simple promotional tour, a few photo opportunities, some handshakes with local officials, but standing here now, looking up at those massive limestone blocks that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, he felt like a child again, small and full of wonder. Dr. Yasmin Khalil, the lead archaeologist who had invited him for this private tour, smiled at the expression on his face, recognizing the look of someone whose life was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. What Michael didn't know, what nobody except a select few knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, a construction crew reinforcing the pyramid's foundation had broken through into a chamber that wasn't supposed to exist. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities had immediately sealed off the area, sworn everyone to secrecy, and called in Dr. Khalil, one of the foremost experts on Old Kingdom architecture and hieroglyphics. What she found inside that hidden chamber had shaken her to her core, and when she emerged after her first exploration, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her flashlight. The discovery was so extraordinary, so potentially world-changing, that the government decided they needed someone with global influence, someone trusted and beloved worldwide, to witness what lay beneath before they made any public announcements. They needed someone whose word carried weight in every corner of the planet. They needed Michael Jordan. As they walked toward the pyramid's entrance, Dr. Khalil kept glancing at Michael, wondering how to prepare him for what he was about to see. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver streaking through her black hair and eyes that had spent decades studying the mysteries of her ancestors. Her father had been an archaeologist too, and her grandfather before that, and she had grown up playing among the ruins of Luxor, treating pharaohs' tombs like other children treated playgrounds. She had dedicated her entire life to understanding ancient Egypt, had published 17 books and over 100 papers, had been interviewed on countless documentaries, but nothing in her career had prepared her for what waited in that hidden chamber. The symbols she had seen there, the artifacts, the implications of it all, kept her awake at night, pacing her apartment in Cairo, questioning everything she thought she knew about human history. Michael followed her into the pyramid, ducking his head, even though the entrance was tall enough for him to walk through upright. The temperature dropped immediately, the desert heat giving way to the cool stillness of the interior, and he felt goosebumps rise on his arms despite his jacket. The narrow passage descended into darkness, lit only by LED strips that had been installed along the floor, and their footsteps echoed in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Behind them walked 3 other people: Ahmed Mansour, the Minister of Antiquities, a nervous man who kept wiping his forehead with a handkerchief; Dr. Robert Chen, an American physicist who had been called in to analyze some of the inexplicable readings they were getting from the chamber; and Fatima Hassan, a young graduate student who served as Dr. Khalil's assistant, and who had been the first person to actually enter the newly discovered space. They descended for what felt like an eternity, going deeper into the pyramid than any tourist ever ventured, passing through passages that had been sealed for thousands of years until the recent breakthrough. Michael's competitive spirit, which had driven him to 6 NBA championships and countless victories, began to stir with a different kind of challenge now. The challenge of understanding something that defied easy explanation. He had always been someone who needed to know, needed to understand, needed to master whatever was in front of him, and this pyramid, this mystery, called to that part of him in a way that basketball never quite had. Basketball was a game he had conquered, but this was history itself, reaching out from the depths of time to touch his life in a single afternoon. Dr. Khalil stopped at a junction where the passage split in 3 directions, and she turned to face Michael directly. Her expression was serious, almost grave, and in the dim light her face looked carved from the same stone that surrounded them. She said his name, just that, just Michael, in a tone that made him pay attention in a way he hadn't since his coach had pulled him aside before Game 7 of the 1998 finals. She told him that what he was about to see would challenge his understanding of history, of human capability, perhaps even of reality itself. She told him that he could turn back now, that there would be no shame in it, that once he saw what lay ahead, he could never unsee it, could never return to the simple certainty of the world he knew before. She asked him if he was ready, really ready, to step into something bigger than himself, bigger than basketball, bigger than fame or fortune or legacy. Michael looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, that competitive fire lighting up his eyes. He had never backed down from a challenge in his life, had never let fear keep him from stepping onto any court, and he wasn't about to start now. He told her to lead the way, and something in his voice, that absolute confidence mixed with genuine curiosity, made Dr. Khalil nod with satisfaction. This was why they had chosen him, she thought. Not because he was famous, though that was important, but because he had the mental toughness to handle what came next, the ability to process the impossible and keep moving forward. They needed someone who wouldn't break under the weight of revelation, and Michael Jordan was nothing if not unbreakable. They took the leftmost passage, descending even deeper, and the air grew cooler still, taking on a quality that Michael couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just temperature, but something else. Like the air itself was older here, heavier with time and secrets. The LED lights ended at a modern steel door that looked completely out of place in the ancient stonework, and Ahmed Mansour stepped forward with a key card, his hands shaking slightly as he swiped it. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing another passage beyond. This one clearly ancient, the walls covered in hieroglyphics that seemed to shimmer in the light from their flashlights. Dr. Khalil pointed out some of the symbols as they walked, but her voice was distracted, and Michael realized she was nervous too, actually nervous about showing him whatever lay ahead. The passage opened into a chamber, and Michael stopped so abruptly that Dr. Chen almost walked into him from behind. The chamber was massive, easily the size of a basketball court, with a ceiling that soared 20 feet overhead, and every single surface was covered in the most intricate hieroglyphics he had ever seen. But that wasn't what stopped him. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist according to everything he knew about ancient Egypt. It looked like a sphere, perfectly smooth and black as midnight, suspended in the midair about 3 feet off the ground with no visible means of support. It was roughly the size of a beach ball, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a darkness so complete that looking at it hurt his eyes. Around the sphere, carved into the floor in a perfect circle, were symbols that didn't match any hieroglyphic system Dr. Khalil had ever studied, and she had studied them all. Michael walked closer, drawn to the sphere despite the warnings shouting in his head to be careful, to be cautious. He had always trusted his instincts on the court, that sixth sense that told him where the defense was weak, where the shot would come from, and those same instincts were screaming at him now that this object was important, was significant in ways he couldn't begin to understand. Dr. Khalil let him approach, watching carefully, and she explained in a quiet voice that they had no idea what the sphere was made of. Every test they had run came back inconclusive. It wasn't metal, wasn't stone, wasn't any material in their database. It didn't register on any electromagnetic spectrum. It didn't have mass that they could measure, yet it clearly existed, clearly occupied space. Dr. Chen had theorized it might be some kind of quantum anomaly, something that existed in a state between matter and energy, but even he admitted that was just speculation. But the sphere wasn't the most shocking thing in the chamber, Dr. Khalil said, and her voice dropped even lower. She gestured to the walls, to the hieroglyphics that covered every inch, and she told Michael that these writings told a story that contradicted every established theory about ancient Egyptian civilization. According to the symbols, the Great Pyramid hadn't been built as a tomb at all. It had been built as a repository, a vault to store something precious beyond measure, something that the ancient Egyptians called the memory of the first world. The hieroglyphics spoke of a civilization that had existed before Egypt, before Sumeria, before any known human culture. A civilization so advanced that it made the modern world look primitive by comparison. This civilization had achieved things that seemed like magic, had understood forces of nature that modern science still couldn't explain, and when they knew their time was ending, when they understood that some cataclysm was coming that would wipe them from existence, they had gathered their knowledge, their history, their very essence, and stored it in objects like this sphere. Michael listened, his mind racing, trying to process what he was hearing. He was a rational man, someone who believed in hard work and practice and the laws of physics that governed how a ball moved through air. But standing here in this chamber, looking at this impossible sphere floating in defiance of gravity, those rational certainties began to crack. He asked Dr. Khalil if she was saying that there was an advanced civilization thousands of years before ancient Egypt, and she nodded, her eyes shining with excitement and fear in equal measure. Not thousands of years, she corrected him. The hieroglyphics suggested tens of thousands of years, maybe more. A civilization that had risen and fallen so long ago that even the ancient Egyptians considered them mythological. The people they called the first ones, the teachers, the builders of the original world. Fatima Hassan, who had been silent until now, spoke up in a voice that trembled with emotion. She told Michael that when she had first entered this chamber, when she had first touched the sphere, something had happened. Images had flooded into her mind, visions of cities that stretched to the horizon, of towers that pierced the clouds, of machines that could do things she had no words to describe. She had seen people, or beings that looked like people, walking through gardens of impossible beauty, had heard music that made her weep with joy, had felt knowledge pouring into her consciousness like water into a dry riverbed. It had lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, she had understood things about mathematics, about physics, about the nature of reality itself that she had never studied, but now knew with absolute certainty. When the visions ended, she had collapsed, and when she woke up hours later, she could speak languages she had never learned, could solve equations she had never studied, could see patterns in nature that had always been invisible to her before. The government had immediately quarantined her, had tested her extensively, afraid that she had been contaminated by something dangerous. But all they found was that her brain activity had changed, had become more active, more interconnected, as if touching the sphere had unlocked capabilities that had been dormant her entire life. Dr. Chen had examined the readings and declared them impossible. The human brain shouldn't be able to rewire itself that quickly, that completely. But the evidence was irrefutable. Fatima wasn't the same person who had entered this chamber 3 weeks ago. She was smarter, more aware, more alive in every measurable way. And the terrifying, thrilling question was, what would happen if more people touched the sphere? What would happen if the whole world gained access to this chamber, to this knowledge from the first world? Michael found himself moving closer to the sphere despite the warnings in his head, despite the fear and uncertainty churning in his gut. His whole life had been about pushing boundaries, about finding out what he was capable of when he gave everything he had, and this felt like the ultimate test. Dr. Khalil called out to him, warned him to be careful, told him they didn't understand the mechanism, didn't know why it had activated for Fatima, or what might happen if someone else touched it. But Michael barely heard her. He was 6 feet away now, then 5, then 4, and he could feel something emanating from the sphere, a vibration that wasn't quite physical but wasn't quite mental either. Something that resonated in that space between thought and sensation. It felt ancient and powerful and somehow welcoming, like it had been waiting for him specifically, like it recognized something in him that even he didn't know was there. He reached out his hand, and the world exploded into light and sound and sensation beyond anything he had ever experienced. He saw the first world in its glory, saw cities that made Manhattan look like a village, saw gardens where plants grew in colors that didn't exist in nature, saw people who moved with grace and purpose that spoke of absolute understanding of themselves and their environment. He saw their technology, machines that bent space and time, that harvested energy from the stars themselves, that could create or destroy with equal ease. He saw their art, beauty so profound that it made him weep without shame, creations that captured the essence of existence itself and reflected it back in ways that expanded consciousness just by witnessing them. He saw their society, a civilization without poverty or war, where every person was valued and nurtured and given the chance to become the fullest version of themselves. But then the visions shifted, and he saw the end coming. He saw the disaster that the first ones had predicted but couldn't prevent. A cosmic event that would reshape the planet, that would bury their cities under miles of ice and water, that would erase them so completely that future civilizations would never know they had existed. He felt their grief, their desperate urgency to preserve something of themselves, to leave a message for the future species that would inherit the Earth. He watched them build the repositories, scatter them across the planet, hide them in ways that would survive any cataclysm. He understood that the pyramids weren't Egyptian in origin at all, but had been built by the first ones as indestructible vaults, later discovered and repurposed by the ancient Egyptians who didn't understand their true purpose. The sphere contained their collective knowledge, their history, their wisdom, accumulated over thousands of years of advancement, all compressed into this single object waiting for the right moment, the right person, to unlock it. Michael saw why they had chosen him, or rather, why the sphere had activated for him. It wasn't about fame or fortune or athletic ability. It was about something deeper, something the first ones had encoded into their creation. The sphere responded to certain qualities of consciousness, to people who had pushed themselves to their absolute limits and come through transformed, to people who understood sacrifice and dedication and the pursuit of excellence beyond reason. Fatima had activated it because her passion for knowledge, her absolute commitment to understanding the past, resonated with the values the first ones had encoded. Michael activated it because his competitive drive, his refusal to accept limitations, his absolute conviction that he could achieve anything he set his mind to, matched the essential characteristics of the first ones themselves. They had been a civilization of competitors too, not against each other but against entropy and ignorance and the limits of possibility. The knowledge flooded into him now. Mathematics and physics and biology and philosophy and arts and technologies. He had no framework to understand but somehow knew anyway. He learned how the pyramids had really been built, not with slaves and ramps, but with an understanding of acoustic levitation that allowed massive stones to be lifted with nothing but sound. He learned how consciousness itself was a fundamental force of the universe, as real and measurable as gravity or electromagnetism, and how the first ones had mastered it, had learned to shape reality itself through focused intention amplified by technology. He learned about the nature of time, how it wasn't linear but flexible, how the past and future existed simultaneously with the present, and how with the right tools and understanding, one could perceive all of it at once. He learned about other worlds beyond Earth, about the vast cosmos teeming with life and consciousness in forms beyond human imagination, and how the first ones had been in contact with some of them, had learned from them and taught them in turn. But with the knowledge came responsibility, and Michael felt the weight of it settling onto his shoulders like the weight of the world itself. The sphere was showing him these things not as entertainment or curiosity, but as a gift and a burden. The first ones had encoded a message into their repositories, a message for whatever species evolved on Earth after the cataclysm. They were saying that humanity was ready now, or at least some humans were ready, to receive this knowledge and continue the work they had begun. But the choice of what to do with it, how to use it, whether to share it or keep it secret, that choice belonged to the ones who activated the sphere. It was a test and a responsibility and an opportunity all rolled together. And Michael understood with sudden clarity why the Egyptian government had brought him here, why they needed someone outside their political structure to make this decision. He pulled his hand back from the sphere, gasping, and Dr. Khalil caught him as his knees buckled. The chamber spun around him and he could barely remember who he was, could barely separate Michael Jordan, the basketball player, from the vast consciousness that had just touched his mind. Dr. Chen was shouting something about readings, about energy spikes, about quantum fluctuations that shouldn't be possible, but his voice sounded distant and tinny, like it was coming from very far away. Fatima was kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and he looked into her eyes and saw recognition there. Saw that she understood exactly what he had just experienced because she had gone through it herself. She smiled at him, and in that smile was welcome and sympathy and something like kinship, Because they were both changed now, both carrying knowledge that set them apart from the rest of humanity. It took Michael almost an hour to regain his equilibrium, to remember how to speak and think in normal human terms rather than the expanded consciousness the sphere had awakened in him. They sat him in a corner of the chamber, brought him water, and let him process what had happened. Ahmed Mansour kept pacing, kept asking if he was all right, clearly worried about the implications of what had just occurred. What if the experience had damaged him somehow? What if Michael Jordan, perhaps the most famous athlete in the world, had been hurt or changed in negative ways by their decision to bring him here? The political ramifications alone could destroy careers, could bring down governments. But Michael wasn't damaged. As his mind settled and he regained his ability to communicate, he realized he felt better than he ever had in his life. More clear-headed, more aware, more capable. It was like he had been living his whole life with blinders on, seeing only a tiny fraction of reality. And now the blinders were gone and he could see everything. The knowledge the sphere had given him wasn't stored in his memory like normal learning. It was integrated into his very consciousness, had become part of how he perceived and understood the world. When he looked at the walls of the chamber now, he could read the hieroglyphics as easily as English, could understand not just the words but the deeper meanings, the layers of significance that the ancient Egyptians had encoded into their writing. When he looked at Dr. Chen's equipment, he could see how it worked, could see the flow of electricity and data, could even see ways to improve its efficiency. More than that, he could see people differently now. Looking at Dr. Khalil, he could perceive the passion that drove her, could see the web of connections between her consciousness and the work she did, could understand her on a level that went beyond words or body language. Looking at Fatima, he saw the transformation she had undergone, saw how she was still adjusting to her expanded awareness, still learning how to function in a world that seemed smaller and more limited than it had before. Looking at Ahmed, he saw fear and ambition tangled together, saw a man torn between his desire to do what was right and his fear of the consequences of radical change. And looking at Dr. Chen, he saw skepticism struggling with wonder, a scientist's mind trying desperately to fit impossible observations into familiar frameworks. Dr. Khalil helped him to his feet, and they stood together in front of the sphere. She asked him what he had seen, what he had learned, and Michael tried to put it into words even though he knew words would never be adequate. He told them about the first world, about the civilization that had existed before recorded history, about their advanced understanding of reality and consciousness and technology. He told them about the cataclysm that had destroyed them, about their desperate attempt to preserve their knowledge for future generations. He told them about the message encoded in the sphere, the invitation and the challenge and the responsibility. And then he looked around at all of them, at these people who had brought him here, who had made him part of this incredible discovery, and he asked the question that mattered most. What happened now? What were they supposed to do with this knowledge? Who got to decide the future of humanity? Ahmed Mansour spoke first, his politician's instincts kicking in despite his obvious discomfort. He suggested they keep it secret, at least for now, at least until they could study it more, understand it better, figure out the implications. The world wasn't ready for this, he argued. If they announced the existence of an advanced prehistorical civilization, if they revealed that there was technology and knowledge hidden in the pyramids that could revolutionize everything from energy production to medicine to space travel, it would cause chaos. Governments would fight over access to it. Corporations would try to exploit it. Religious groups would deny it or demonize it. Better to move slowly, to carefully parse out the information over years or decades, to control the narrative and minimize disruption. But Dr. Khalil disagreed strongly, her voice rising with passion. She argued that the knowledge belonged to humanity, all of humanity, not to a select few who got to decide what others were allowed to know. The first ones had left this gift for everyone, had specifically designed it to be accessible to anyone who was ready to receive it. Keeping it secret would be a betrayal of their intention, would be the same kind of gatekeeping that had held humanity back throughout history. She acknowledged the risks, the potential for chaos and conflict, but she believed that the benefits far outweighed the dangers. Imagine what humanity could accomplish with access to this knowledge, she said. Imagine a world where energy was abundant and free, where disease was eradicated, where consciousness itself was understood and nurtured. The problems that seemed insurmountable today would become trivial. The conflicts that threatened to destroy civilization would seem petty and pointless in the face of understanding our true place in the cosmos. Dr. Chen took a middle position, suggesting they needed more time to understand what they were dealing with before making any decisions. As a scientist, he was thrilled by the possibilities, but he was also cautious about the implications. The sphere had changed Fatima, and now Michael, in measurable ways, had enhanced their cognitive abilities and expanded their consciousness. What if exposing millions or billions of people to this technology had unintended consequences? What if there were side effects they hadn't discovered yet? What if the transformation wasn't beneficial for everyone? If some people couldn't handle the expansion of consciousness and were damaged by it? They needed to study the sphere, needed to understand the mechanism, needed to test it carefully and systematically before deciding whether to share it with the world. Fatima, the youngest person in the chamber and the one who had lived longest with the transformation, offered her perspective. She said that the sphere had given her a gift beyond measure, had awakened capabilities she never knew she possessed, had made her life richer and more meaningful in every way. But she also acknowledged that it had been difficult, that there were days when she felt overwhelmed by her expanded awareness, when she missed the simplicity of not understanding so much, not seeing so deeply into the nature of things. She didn't regret her transformation, but she understood that not everyone would welcome it. Some people were comfortable with mystery, with not knowing, with living within the boundaries of normal human consciousness. Forcing this knowledge on them would be cruel, would be a violation of their autonomy. But offering it, making it available to those who wanted it, who were ready for it, that seemed right to her. Michael listened to all of them, and he felt the weight of the decision settling more heavily on his shoulders. They were looking to him now, he realized, waiting for him to speak, to guide them. It wasn't because he was the smartest person in the room or the most qualified, but because he was the outsider, the one with no political agenda, no career invested in the outcome. He was also, thanks to his fame and the respect he commanded worldwide, the one person who might be able to sway public opinion regardless of what the governments and institutions decided. If Michael Jordan spoke about this discovery, the world would listen. If he endorsed sharing the knowledge, it would be nearly impossible for anyone to keep it secret. If he urged caution, people would respect that too. He thought about his career, about all the years he had spent perfecting his craft, pushing himself beyond what anyone thought possible, inspiring millions to believe they could achieve their dreams through hard work and dedication. He thought about the kids who had worn his shoes, who had hung his posters on their walls, who had learned from his example that limitations were mostly in the mind. He thought about the responsibility that came with influence, with being a role model whether you wanted to be or not. And he thought about the first ones, about the civilization that had achieved greatness and then lost everything, and how they had chosen to reach across the ages to offer their hard-won wisdom to whoever came after. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was quiet but certain. He said that this knowledge was a gift, but gifts didn't have to be accepted all at once, didn't have to be forced on anyone who wasn't ready. He proposed a middle path, something that honored all the perspectives in the room. They would announce the discovery, would tell the world about the hidden chamber in the sphere, and the evidence of the first world civilization. They would share the basics of what the sphere contained, the knowledge and technology and wisdom of an advanced pre-historical culture. But they wouldn't force anyone to interact with the sphere directly, wouldn't require anyone to undergo the transformation. Instead, they would make it available, carefully controlled and monitored, to people who volunteered, who understood the risks and chose to take them anyway. They would study the process, would learn from each person who touched the sphere, would build an understanding of how it worked and what it did, and gradually, as more people transformed and shared their experiences, as the knowledge began to filter into society through those who had received it directly, humanity as a whole would evolve. It wouldn't be instant, wouldn't be chaotic, but it would be inexorable, a slow rising tide that lifted everyone eventually. Some people would choose to transform immediately, would rush to touch the sphere and expand their consciousness. Others would wait, would watch and see what happened to the early adopters. And some might never choose to transform at all, might live their whole lives in normal consciousness, and that was okay too. The important thing was that the choice existed, that the knowledge was available to anyone who wanted it, but that nobody was forced to change against their will. Dr. Khalil smiled at his words, tears shining in her eyes, because she recognized the wisdom in his approach. Ahmed Mansour looked relieved because it offered a path forward that wouldn't cause immediate chaos. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, appreciating the scientific rigor implied in carefully studying each transformation. And Fatima squeezed Michael's hand, grateful that he understood the importance of choice, of autonomy, of respecting each person's right to decide their own path. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle, one more revelation that needed to be shared. Dr. Khalil gestured to another corner of the chamber, to an area they hadn't yet explored, and she told Michael there was something else he needed to see. They walked across the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the vast space, and she showed him a series of smaller spheres, perhaps 20 of them, arranged in a circle on the floor. These were different from the large central sphere, smaller and made of what looked like crystal rather than that light-absorbing darkness. Dr. Khalil explained that they believed these were seeds, copies of the knowledge contained in the large sphere, designed to be taken out of the chamber and distributed. The first ones had anticipated that their repositories might be discovered, had planned for the knowledge to spread beyond a single location. Michael picked up one of the crystal spheres, and the moment his fingers touched it, he understood its purpose. These seeds didn't contain the full knowledge of the first world, but they contained enough to transform anyone who touched them, to awaken the same expanded consciousness he now possessed. They were portable, could be taken anywhere, could activate for anyone who was ready. And there were repositories like this one all over the world, Dr. Khalil told him, hidden in pyramids and temples and sacred sites that ancient cultures had built on top of even more ancient structures. The first ones had scattered their knowledge across the planet, had ensured that no single disaster, no single failure could erase them completely. This chamber in the Great Pyramid was just one of many, and now that humanity had found this one, they would inevitably find the others. The implications were staggering. If there were 20 seeds here, and similar chambers existed at other sites around the world, there could be hundreds or thousands of these seeds waiting to be discovered. The transformation of human consciousness wouldn't be limited to a few people making pilgrimages to Egypt. It could happen anywhere, everywhere, all at once if they chose to distribute the seeds. Michael looked down at the crystal sphere in his hand, feeling its weight, feeling the knowledge and potential it contained, and he understood that this was the real decision point. Not whether to share the knowledge, because that was inevitable, but how fast to share it, how widely to distribute these seeds, how quickly to allow humanity to evolve. Ahmed Mansour was shaking his head, backing away from the seeds like they were dangerous explosives. He argued that they absolutely could not distribute these, could not risk transforming too many people too quickly. The social order would collapse, he said, if millions of people suddenly gained expanded consciousness, suddenly saw through the illusions that held society together, suddenly understood that most of the systems and structures humans had built were arbitrary and unnecessary. You couldn't have government, couldn't have economy, couldn't have civilization as they knew it if everyone was transformed. Dr. Chen agreed, pointing out that they didn't understand the mechanism well enough, didn't know if there were limits to how many people could be safely transformed, didn't know what would happen to society if consciousness expansion happened too rapidly. But Dr. Khalil saw it differently. She argued that the current social order was already collapsing, that climate change and inequality and conflict were pushing humanity toward catastrophe. Maybe what they needed was exactly this kind of rapid transformation, this forced evolution that would make people see beyond their petty differences and recognize their common humanity. Maybe the first ones had designed it this way deliberately, had created enough seeds to transform everyone because they knew that was the only way to save a species from self-destruction. Half measures wouldn't work. Gradual change would be overwhelmed by entrenched interests. What humanity needed was a quantum leap, a sudden shift that would make the old problems irrelevant. Fatima offered a different perspective, one informed by her own experience. She said that the transformation wasn't something you could force on people successfully anyway. The sphere activated for people who were ready, whose consciousness was already reaching toward expansion. If someone wasn't ready, If they were closed-minded or fearful or too attached to their current worldview, the sphere wouldn't activate for them. They could touch it all day, and nothing would happen. So distributing the seeds widely wouldn't necessarily mean transforming everyone. It would just make the opportunity available to everyone who was capable of benefiting from it. Natural selection would do the rest, would ensure that those who transformed were the ones who could handle it. Michael stood in the center of the chamber, holding the crystal seed, feeling the weight of history and future pressing down on him from all sides. He thought about his own transformation, about how he had spent his entire career pushing beyond limits, refusing to accept that anything was impossible, and how that attitude had made him receptive to the sphere. He thought about all the people in the world who shared that drive, that refusal to be limited, that hunger to be more than they currently were, and he thought about the people who didn't share it, who were happy with their lives as they were, who didn't want to change or grow or push boundaries. Both groups deserved respect. Both perspectives were valid. Finally, he made his decision, and it felt right in a way that nothing else had since he retired from basketball. He said they would take the middle path here too, would distribute some seeds but not all of them, would make the transformation available but not ubiquitous. They would work with trusted partners around the world, scientists and philosophers and spiritual leaders who understood the magnitude of what they were dealing with. They would place seeds in institutions and centers where people could come voluntarily to undergo transformation, knowing full well what they were choosing. They would create a network, a community of the transformed who could support each other and help integrate the knowledge into society gradually. But they would also keep some seeds here, in this chamber, protected and preserved. Because humanity would need time to adjust, would need the option to pause if things went wrong, would need to maintain continuity with its past, even as it evolved toward its future. The transformation would happen, Michael said. That was inevitable now that they had rediscovered the First World's legacy. But it would happen at a pace humanity could absorb, with care and intention and respect for those who chose differently. Dr. Khalil agreed to his plan, as did Dr. Chen after some thought. Ahmed Mansour was harder to convince, but eventually he acknowledged that Michael's approach was probably the most politically viable, the most likely to gain acceptance from world leaders and institutions. Fatima was quiet, and when Michael asked her what she thought, she smiled sadly and said that she wished everyone could experience what she had experienced, could feel the expansion and the awakening and the joy of understanding. But she also knew that forcing enlightenment on people was a contradiction in terms, that consciousness couldn't be expanded through coercion. So yes, she supported his decision, even though part of her wanted to scatter the seeds like wheat and let them fall where they may. They spent the next hour making plans, discussing logistics, talking about who to contact and how to announce the discovery. Michael would hold a press conference, they decided, would tell the world about what he had found in the Great Pyramid. His fame and credibility would lend weight to the announcement, would make it impossible to dismiss or ignore. Dr. Khalil would present the academic evidence, would show the hieroglyphics and explain their significance. Dr. Chen would discuss the scientific aspects, the measurements and observations that supported the existence of the sphere and its effects. Ahmed Mansour would represent the Egyptian government, would announce the decision to make the chamber accessible to researchers and eventually to the public. But before all that, before they returned to the surface and changed the world forever, Michael asked for a moment alone in the chamber. The others looked at each other, uncertain, but something in his expression made them nod and file out, leaving him standing there in the darkness illuminated only by his flashlight and the strange non-light that seemed to emanate from the sphere itself. He walked back to the large central sphere, stood before it, and placed both hands on its surface. The contact was electric, overwhelming, and the knowledge flooded into him again, deeper this time, more complete. He understood now that the sphere wasn't just a repository of information. It was something more, something almost alive. It was the collective consciousness of the First World, the combined awareness of billions of beings who had chosen to upload themselves, to become data and energy rather than face complete extinction. They were still there, Michael realized with shock and wonder. The first ones weren't truly dead, weren't truly gone. They existed in the sphere, in a state beyond physical life, waiting for the day when their knowledge would be rediscovered and their consciousness could interact with the world again through the minds of those they transformed. When Fatima had touched the sphere, when Michael had touched it, they hadn't just received information. They had made contact with the first ones themselves, had allowed those ancient consciousnesses to see the world through their eyes, to experience reality through their transformed awareness. It was symbiosis, a merging of past and present, of ancient wisdom and modern perspective. And there was something else, something the sphere showed him now that he was alone, that it hadn't shared while the others were present. The cataclysm that had destroyed the first world wasn't random, wasn't just a natural disaster. It was part of a cycle, a recurring event that happened every 12,000 years or so, resetting civilization, wiping the slate clean. The first ones had known it was coming, had tried to prepare, had built their repositories and encoded their knowledge, but they hadn't been able to stop it. And the cycle was coming around again, Michael understood with a chill. Maybe not tomorrow or next year, but within a few generations. The signs were already visible to those who knew how to look. The climate shifts and magnetic anomalies and astronomical alignments that presaged the coming catastrophe. That was why the sphere had activated now, why the repositories were revealing themselves. The first ones were reaching across time not just to share their knowledge, but to warn humanity, to give them a chance to prepare, to possibly prevent or survive what was coming. The transformation wasn't just about expanding consciousness for its own sake. It was about giving humanity the tools they would need to face the cyclical cataclysm, to break the pattern of destruction and rebirth that had repeated endlessly throughout history. Every 12,000 years, civilization rose and fell. Knowledge was gained and lost, and the planet reset itself. But maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time, armed with the wisdom of the first world, humanity could break the cycle, could survive and transcend. Michael pulled his hands away from the sphere, staggered by what he now knew. Should he tell the others? Should he share this final revelation, or would it cause panic and despair? He decided to tell them, because they deserved to know, because hiding the truth would be a betrayal of everything the first one stood for. When he emerged from the chamber, Dr. Khalil took one look at his face and knew something had changed. She asked what he had learned, and Michael told them everything about the collective consciousness in the sphere, about the cyclical cataclysms, about the real reason the first ones had left their knowledge. The others listened in silence, their faces going pale as they understood the implications. Ahmed Mansour wanted to suppress this part, wanted to announce the discovery without mentioning the coming catastrophe. It would cause too much fear, too much chaos, he argued. But Michael shook his head firmly. The truth was the truth, and people had a right to know what they were facing. Yes, it would be frightening, but humans had always risen to challenges when they understood what was at stake. Hiding the danger would only make people complacent, would waste precious time that could be spent preparing. If they knew that a cataclysm was coming, that they had a few generations to prepare, they would work together, would pool their resources and knowledge, would do what needed to be done. Dr. Khalil agreed, though she looked shaken by the revelation. This changed everything, she said. The transformation wasn't just about personal growth or expanding human potential, it was about survival. The enhanced consciousness, the advanced knowledge, the technological understanding encoded in the sphere, all of it was designed to give humanity the tools they would need to face what was coming. Understanding that made the decision to share the knowledge even more urgent. They couldn't afford to move slowly, couldn't afford to let political concerns or fear of disruption slow them down. Humanity needed to transform, and quickly, if they wanted to survive. The press conference happened 3 days later, and it was carried live by every major news outlet in the world. Michael Jordan, standing beside Dr. Khalil and flanked by Egyptian officials, announced that a discovery had been made in the Great Pyramid, a discovery that would change humanity's understanding of its own history. He described the hidden chamber, the mysterious sphere, the evidence of an advanced civilization that had existed thousands of years before recorded history. He talked about his own experience touching the sphere, about the knowledge and transformation it had given him. He was careful to be honest about the challenges and uncertainties, to acknowledge that they didn't have all the answers yet, but he also conveyed the immense potential, the incredible opportunity this discovery represented. Dr. Khalil presented the academic evidence, showing photographs of the hieroglyphics, explaining their translation, describing the implications for everything historians thought they knew about human civilization. Dr. Chen discussed the scientific measurements, the anomalous readings from the sphere, the documented changes in brain activity among those who had touched it. And finally, Michael delivered the hardest part, the warning about the cyclical cataclysm, the revelation that humanity was facing an existential threat within a few generations. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't minimize the danger, but he also emphasized the hope, the possibility that this time could be different, that armed with the first world's knowledge, humanity might finally break the cycle. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Some people embraced the news with excitement and hope, saw it as the dawn of a new age for humanity. Others rejected it completely, called it a hoax or a delusion, refused to believe that everything they knew about history was wrong. Religious groups were divided, with some seeing the discovery as proof of divine plan and others condemning it as heresy. Scientists demanded access to the chamber, wanted to study the sphere, and verify the claims. Governments scrambled to figure out the implications, the geopolitical consequences of this knowledge becoming widely available. Stock markets plunged as investors panicked about the coming cataclysm, then surged as people realized the technological advances implied by the first world's knowledge. Michael had expected chaos, but the reality was more complex than he had imagined. Yes, there was disruption and confusion, but there was also an outpouring of unity and purpose that he hadn't anticipated. People began to see beyond their differences, began to recognize that the challenges they faced required working together. If a cataclysm was coming that would affect everyone, then old conflicts suddenly seemed petty and pointless. Countries that had been enemies for generations began to talk about cooperation. Religious leaders from different faiths met to discuss how their traditions might be reconciled with this new understanding. Scientists from around the world formed collaborative networks to study the sphere and begin implementing the knowledge it contained. The Egyptian government, true to their word, opened the chamber for controlled visits. Scientists, philosophers, spiritual leaders, and volunteers came from every corner of the planet to touch the sphere, to undergo transformation. Not everyone who tried was successful, as Fatima had predicted. The sphere only activated for those who were ready, whose consciousness was already reaching toward expansion. But enough people transformed that a community began to form, a network of enhanced humans who shared the knowledge of the first world and worked to integrate it into modern society. They called themselves the Awakened, and they became teachers and guides, helping others understand what was possible, helping society transition to a new way of being. Michael found himself at the center of this movement, not because he wanted to be a leader, but because people looked to him as a symbol of transformation. If Michael Jordan could change, could expand his consciousness and embrace knowledge that challenged everything he thought he knew, then anyone could. He used his influence carefully, always emphasizing personal choice and individual autonomy, always respecting those who chose not to transform. He worked with the Awakened to establish centers around the world where the crystal seeds were available, where people could come to learn and possibly undergo transformation themselves. He advocated for research into the coming cataclysm, for investment in technologies that might help humanity survive or prevent it. And he tried, as much as possible, to live a normal life, to maintain connections with friends and family who hadn't transformed, to remember what it was like to be fully human in the old sense. But normal was impossible now, he realized as months passed and then years. He was too different, knew too much, saw too deeply. Looking at the world through transformed consciousness was both gift and curse. He could see the beauty in everything, could understand the intricate connections that bound all things together, could perceive patterns and possibilities that had been invisible before. But he could also see the suffering, the waste, the unnecessary limitations that humanity imposed on itself out of fear and ignorance. It frustrated him sometimes, made him angry, made him want to force people to understand, to change, to wake up. But he reminded himself of his own choice, of the decision he had made in the chamber to respect everyone's autonomy, to let transformation happen at its own pace. The world changed slowly but inexorably over the following decade. The awakened grew in numbers as more people touched the sphere and the seeds, as more repositories were discovered around the world. They brought new technologies, new approaches to problems, new ways of organizing society. Energy became abundant as they implemented systems based on the first world's understanding of physics. Disease rates plummeted as medical knowledge advanced by centuries in just a few years. Conflicts decreased as more leaders underwent transformation and began to see beyond tribal and national divisions. It wasn't utopia, wasn't perfect, but it was progress, undeniable and accelerating. And always, in the background, was the knowledge of what was coming, the countdown to the next cataclysm. The awakened worked tirelessly to prepare, to build infrastructure that could survive the coming disaster, to develop technologies that might mitigate or prevent it. They studied the cyclical nature of the catastrophe, tried to understand its cause, searched for ways to break the pattern. They found other repositories, discovered more of the first world's knowledge, pieced together a more complete picture of what had happened and what might happen again. And slowly, a plan began to form. A way that humanity might finally transcend the cycle that had trapped it for hundreds of thousands of years. Michael, now in his 60s but looking decades younger thanks to the biological knowledge he had gained, stood once again in the hidden chamber beneath the Great Pyramid. 20 years had passed since that first visit, since the moment that had changed his life and changed the world. The chamber was different now, no longer secret, no longer hidden. It had become a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to connect with the knowledge of the first world, to perhaps undergo transformation themselves. The sphere still floated in the center, still absorbed light and radiated that strange sense of presence, but Michael no longer felt afraid of it. It was familiar now, almost comfortable, like coming home. Dr. Isa Khalil stood beside him, aged and wise, her silver hair now completely white. Fatima was there too, now a respected leader among the awakened, her youthful enthusiasm tempered by years of experience. Dr. Chen had passed away 2 years earlier, his curiosity finally satisfied, his skepticism transformed into certainty. Ahmed Mansour had retired from politics, admitting that the old ways of governance no longer made sense in a world where consciousness itself had evolved. They had gathered here to mark the anniversary, to remember that first discovery, to reflect on how far humanity had come. But they had also come for another reason, one that Michael had only recently learned. The sphere had shown him something new, a final revelation that the first ones had encoded into their repository, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The cataclysm wasn't inevitable, wasn't an unchangeable force of nature. It was something that could be prevented, but only if humanity reached a certain threshold of consciousness. Only if enough people transformed that the collective awareness of the species shifted. The first ones had understood this, had encoded it into their plan. The repositories weren't just about preserving knowledge or warning future generations. They were about catalyzing transformation, about creating a species that was conscious enough to break the cycle. And they were close now, Michael knew. The awakened had grown to billions, nearly half of humanity. More people underwent transformation every day. The collective consciousness of humanity was shifting, was beginning to resonate at frequencies that could affect reality itself. The first ones had achieved this state before their civilization fell, but too late to save themselves. They had left their knowledge hoping that the next cycle would move faster, would achieve critical mass before the cataclysm hit. And thanks to technology, thanks to global communication and shared knowledge, this cycle had moved much faster. Humanity might actually make it, might actually achieve conscious evolution in time to prevent the catastrophe rather than just survive it. Michael placed his hands on the sphere one last time, and he felt the presence of the first ones more clearly than ever before. They were proud of humanity, he sensed, proud of what this young species had accomplished in such a short time. They had been cautious and slow, had taken millennia to achieve what humanity had done in mere decades. And now, if the current trajectory continued, if enough people chose transformation, humanity would transcend the cycle entirely, would achieve a state of consciousness that was immune to the forces that had destroyed every previous iteration of civilization on Earth. They would become something new, something the universe had been waiting for, a species that was fully conscious, fully aware, fully alive in every possible sense. As Michael stood there in the chamber, surrounded by people he loved, connected through the sphere to the consciousness of beings who had lived and died tens of thousands of years ago, he felt something he had never felt even at the height of his basketball career. Not just satisfaction or accomplishment, but completion. He had thought his purpose was to win championships, to inspire people through athletic excellence, to be the best at a game. But that had just been preparation, he realized now, training for something much bigger. His real purpose had been this: to be the bridge between humanity's past and its future, to use his influence and credibility to help his species take the next evolutionary step. The sphere pulsed with light suddenly, brighter than he had ever seen it, and Michael understood that this was a message, a communication from the first ones to all the awakened around the world. The threshold had been reached, the critical mass achieved. Humanity had transformed enough that the collective consciousness could now affect the fundamental forces that drove the cataclysmic cycle. Over the next few years, working together, leveraging the knowledge they had gained and the consciousness they had achieved, humanity would take action. They would stabilize the planetary systems that caused the cyclical disasters, would harmonize with cosmic forces rather than being subject to them, would essentially graduate from being victims of nature to being conscious participants in the universe's evolution. It wouldn't be easy, the sphere conveyed, and not everyone would survive the transition. But humanity as a species would persist, would thrive, would continue to grow and evolve. And more than that, they would remember. They would remember the first world, would honor the sacrifice of those ancient beings who had given up physical existence to preserve their knowledge for future generations. They would remember what they had learned in this chamber and others like it around the world. They would remember that consciousness itself was the most powerful force in the universe. That awareness and intention and understanding could literally shape reality. And they would carry that knowledge forward, would share it with other species they encountered among the stars, would become the teachers and guides for the next iteration of conscious evolution. Michael pulled his hands away from the sphere for the last time, and he smiled through tears that he wasn't ashamed to shed. Dr. Khalil was crying too, understanding what the sphere had shown them, understanding that their work was essentially complete. Fatima was laughing with joy and relief, her whole body shaking with emotion. And around the world, billions of awakened felt the same message, felt the same understanding, felt the same certainty that humanity had finally broken free from the cycle that had imprisoned it for so long. In the years that followed, the prophecy proved true. Humanity worked together in ways that had seemed impossible just decades earlier, implementing technologies and approaches that addressed the root causes of the cyclical catastrophe. The Earth's magnetic field, which had been weakening and preparing to flip, was stabilized through applications of consciousness-enhanced physics that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. The cosmic forces that drove climate cycles were harmonized rather than resisted. The geological instabilities that caused mega-earthquakes and volcanic eruptions were addressed through techniques that operated at quantum levels, affecting probability itself. It was the greatest cooperative achievement in human history, and it worked. The cataclysm that had destroyed every previous advanced civilization on Earth, that had reset human progress over and over again for hundreds of thousands of years, simply didn't happen. The cycle was broken. Humanity had evolved, had transformed, had become conscious enough to change its own fate. And Michael Jordan, who had been chosen for his competitive fire and his refusal to accept limitations, who had touched a mysterious sphere in a hidden chamber beneath the Great Pyramid, who had received knowledge from a civilization that died before recorded history began, had played his part in saving not just a species, but an entire lineage of consciousness that stretched back to the beginning of time itself. That was what Michael Jordan discovered inside the Great Pyramid, a discovery that shocked Egypt and changed the world forever. Not gold or treasure or the tombs of ancient kings, but something infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that humanity's greatest achievements lay not in its past, but in its future. And that transformation was not just possible but necessary. Not just personal but collective. Not just a choice but a calling that echoed across the ages from those who came before to those who would come after. So where are you listening from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below, because we love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed us, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep spreading kindness and incredible stories to everyone. And don't go anywhere yet, because the video appearing on your screen right now has another mind-blowing story you absolutely need to hear. Thanks for watching, and remember to always stay curious.